Welcome to Module 1. This module will explore who we are as FSL educators and how our identities influence our pedagogies and relationships with learners. Our goal is to make important connections between the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy and intercultural understanding and awareness. Every day, French as a second language students in Ontario are immersed in a diverse and culturally rich learning environment. Teachers and students who live in both large urban centers and small, seemingly monocultural communities know that no classroom is monolithic. It is important that teachers acquire a clear understanding of intercultural understanding in order to infuse its basic principles in daily teaching practices. You'll find a glossary of terms for all words bolded in the viewer's guide at the end of this document. When FSL teachers support learners as intercultural communicators, they are aligning their practice with the Ontario Ministry of Education's wider mandate to implement equity and inclusive practices throughout Ontario schools. Intercultural education provides students with the preparation and the experience to develop meaningful and respectful understanding and relationships with others. The student's own identifications, knowledge, attitudes, and set of beliefs should be critically analyzed and valued in order to allow them to understand and appreciate various and diverse Francophone, Francophile, and non Francophone communities located in Canada and abroad. There are a few key goals for this module. First, we are reflecting on identity so that we can take account for our positionality and how identity informs French as a second language pedagogy and learning. Second, the goal will be to focus on intercultural understanding and awareness and culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP, as complementary pedagogical stances and anti-oppressive teaching strategies and developing critical consciousness are key elements of this pedagogical stance. Finally, we will make connections between FSL curriculum, intercultural understanding, and awareness, competence, and CRP in an effort to develop a mindset for exploring identity and culture. Throughout this module, you will be challenged to think about who you are as an FSL educator and more specifically about your personal value systems, your beliefs, and the attitudes that define and guide your teaching practice. Taking account of your own identity as an FSL educator is an important step towards being a reflective practitioner whose goal is to engage in conversations and thought processes that push personal and professional growth as a way to maximize student success. Let's begin by unpacking the notion of identity. What do you bring to the classroom? How has your personal history, childhood experiences, and or school trajectories influenced how you see yourself as an FSL educator? How have your personal and professional experiences impacted your instructional practice? These questions are deeply rooted in your positionality as an FSL educator, and more specifically, it's crucial to situate yourself as a way to question personal ways of knowing and being that directly impact how you teach and what you value in the context of pedagogy. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider these questions. The notion of identity is complex. This is where we need to understand the term intersectionality. Intersectionality refers to the multifaceted aspects describing a person, including but not limited to race, religion, gender, social class, ethnicity, disability, or gender identity. Please check the viewer's guide for an in-depth understanding of intersectionality and its relevance in the context of discrimination. In the next slide, we will delve further into the complexity associated to identity and how it relates to confronting personal bias as a way to minimize discrimination and stereotypes. Identity is a key factor in understanding positionality as it challenges us to consider personal bias, implicit and explicit, which can result in stereotypes and discrimination. As we work through some of these examples related to bias and the implications for the FSL classroom, think about how bias is directly related to your belief systems and values, and how this impacts your teaching practice, how you interact with students, and the ways that you approach the curriculum. Firstly, let's unpack the term bias. It is a tendency that can result in preferential or unfair treatment of students. It can also be associated with a perception of French language or cultures that favor one way of speaking, intonation, accent, geographic location, or otherwise. Implicit bias points to the fact that as educators, we cannot be neutral. Without consciously knowing it, we hold judgments and belief systems about students based on, and not limited to, race, gender, social class ability, and other social identities. As educators, let's ensure that we challenge our limiting beliefs regarding culturally and linguistically diverse students in FSL. In terms of teaching materials, implicit bias can also be associated with unconsciously perpetuating stereotypes related to French culture and language. For example, using the French flag to depict la francophonie without contextualizing it in the context of colonialism and linguistic imperialism. Explicit bias can be described as the conscious attitudes and beliefs that result in a direct thought and action that can manifest itself in the unfair or preferential treatment of students based on and not limited to race, gender, socioeconomic status, ability, and other social identities. Explicit bias can be associated with teaching and learning materials that validate cycles of oppression related to dominant culture or traditional ways of knowing and being. Examples of explicit bias could be asking students to discuss and write about summer holidays at the cottage. The assumption here is that all students have access to cottages. Another example of explicit bias is making overt statements such as French from Quebec is not as good as French from France. Now, let's focus on who our students are as a way to create learning opportunities that embrace and celebrate their identities in inclusive FSL spaces. Please refer to the viewer's guide for a step by step activity called the Human Library. As FSL educators, through this type of activity, we challenge ourselves and our students to go beyond the surface about our identities, to confront stereotypes and or ideas that may influence how we perceive each other. By getting to know our students and more importantly, letting students get to know each other, we move away from making assumptions about others. According to the Ontario FSL curriculum, the framework described in Stepping Stones, an Ontario Ministry resource on youth development, supports the importance of identity on a deeper level. The visual on this slide reminds us that as FSL educators, we need to fully understand students' development and the components which contribute to a healthy sense of self. Cognitive development refers to brain development, processing, and reasoning skills, use of strategies for learning. Emotional development refers to emotional regulation, empathy, motivation. Social development refers to self concept, self efficacy, self esteem, identity formation, gender identity, social group identity, spiritual identity, relationships, peer, family, romantic. Physical development refers to physical activity, sleep patterns, changes that come with puberty, body image, nutritional requirements. It is important to note that this chart is rooted in indigenous ways of knowing and being and are interconnected to the healthy development of the mind, body, and spirit. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider these questions. What considerations are there for teaching and learning when working with students of diverse experiences and backgrounds than ourselves? What considerations are there for teaching and learning when working with students of similar experiences and backgrounds than ourselves? Culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP, is an inspiration to any French as a second language educator aspiring to develop effective intercultural understanding and competence in their learners. This pedagogy was famously coined by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings in the 1990s. In her seminal research, Ladson-Billings used an acid-based lens to conduct an ethnographic study of 8 excellent educators and their role in supporting Black students in their success, despite anti-Black conditions in schools and in society at large. Ladson-Billings describes culturally relevant pedagogy as a pedagogy of opposition committed to collective, not merely individual empowerment. Ladson-Billings distilled the pedagogy observed in these effective educators in 3 criteria. Number 1, students must experience academic success. Number 2, students must develop or maintain cultural competence. Number 3, students must develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. Good teaching of intercultural understanding and awareness in French as a second language classrooms reflect closely the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy. Let's look at intercultural competence and the French as a second language curriculum more closely by adding Barham's model of intercultural communicative competence. This diagram is a model of intercultural communicative competence proposed by Dr. Michael Barham and colleagues. It was developed as a part of the Council of Europe's project to construct a common European framework of reference for languages, or CEFR. The model of intercultural communicative competence outlines the key components: intercultural attitudes, knowledge, critical awareness, and skills that language learners should develop in order to become mediators of diverse identities and cultural groups. The 5 components of Barham's model are as follows: savoir, or knowledge, of social groups and their products and practices in one's interlocutor's country, and of the general processes of societal and individual interaction. Savoir comprendre, or skills of interpreting and relating, are abilities to interpret a document or event from another culture, to explain it, and relate it to documents or events from one's own. Savoir s'engager, or critical cultural awareness, is an ability to evaluate critically and on the basis of explicit criteria, perspectives, practices, and products in one's own and other cultures and countries. Savoir apprendre, or faire, or skills of discovery and interaction, are abilities that help learners acquire new knowledge of a culture and cultural practices, and the ability to operate knowledge, attitudes, and skills under the constraints of real-time communication and interaction. Savoir-être, or intercultural attitudes, are a curiosity and openness, readiness to suspend disbelief about other cultures and belief about one's own. Even though Barham's model of intercultural communicative competence demonstrates some interest about equity in education, as Dr. Paul Gorski, an equity and social justice educator, suggests, be wary of some culture-centric frameworks that may be implemented in ways that essentialize marginalized students and mask the forms of structural injustice that feed educational outcome disparities. To read more about Dr. Paul Gorski's work on rethinking the role of culture in educational equity, please see his article in the Viewer's Guide. There are aspects of Byram's intercultural communicative competence model that relates to French as a second language programs in Ontario. In the model, savoir and savoir comprendre resembles the student's role from the front matter of the French as a second language curriculum, which states that through reflection or their use of French, students will deepen their appreciation and understanding of French as of themselves and others. Byram's savoir-apprendre and savoir-faire speak to skills of discovery and interaction and communication. Similarly, in one of the 7 fundamental concepts of French as a second language, making real-world connections, it's proposed that meaningful contact with French-speaking individuals in students' communities enables students to develop skills in real-life situations. Finally, the components of savoir-être and s'engager resembles that of key instructional approaches in the French as a second language curriculum, which states that effective instruction motivates students and instills positive habits of mind such as curiosity and open-mindedness, a willingness to think, question, and be questioned. Educators may not see the interconnectedness of the intercultural communicative competence model, the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, and the French as a second language curriculum in Ontario. The following slides demonstrate how these two concepts support FSL educators in establishing the conditions for intercultural awareness and understanding to thrive. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. What are the interconnectedness between Byram's intercultural communicative competence model, Gloria Ladson-Billings' tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, intercultural awareness and understanding in French as a second language programs? First, let's look at culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP. Academic success is an important tenet of CRP. Gloria Ladson-Billings believed that despite systemic barriers, it is essential that all students develop their academic skills and demonstrate academic competence and excellence. A French as a second language educator who adopts a culturally relevant stance in their pedagogy holds high expectations for their students and provides the support necessary and develops classroom conditions with intent so that learners experience success consistently. The CRP FSL educator regards learners with an asset-based lens. They believe that all FSL learners can and will learn French. In order to ensure learner motivation and engagement, a CRP FSL educator makes use of effective strategies like active learning, inquiry, self-assessment, and relevant sociocultural opportunities. They employ necessary differentiated methods tailored to the FSL learner profile, believing that academic success in FSL for all learners is achievable. As described in the previous slides, Byram's model reminds us of connecting savoir and savoir comprendre in order for learners to begin the work of critically analyzing and exploring culture and cultural aspects. Cultural competence is another important tenet of culturally relevant pedagogy. Ladson-Billings observed that effective culturally relevant educators harness student cultural competence and use student culture as a vehicle for learning. Examples of this in the French as a second language classroom could be the integration of family and community knowledge in learning and translanguaging for plurilingual students. Cultural competence is key to establishing an FSL classroom that is relevant and responsive. The educator encourages their learners to realize their own ever-changing cultural identities as an integral part of their learning. Students come to FSL classrooms as cultural beings, We don't have to teach them aspects of culture, they are culture. The educator who teaches with a culturally relevant lens supports learners in developing intercultural competence and recognizes and extends students' existing thoughts about culture. A culturally relevant educator is critical of their own assumptions about cultures, in particular, limiting and essentializing French cultures, student potential, and what students have to offer to the experience of French language learning and interculturalism. French as a second language educators, in particular, must put into question their own biases, beliefs, and value systems regarding varieties of French, not favoring one over another, but rather creating opportunities for students to see these varieties in context. Languages that are part of this learner's identity and language portfolio cannot be viewed as the enemy to additional language acquisition, but rather should be framed as a resource. Finally, critical cultural consciousness is one of the most important tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy and one that teachers often ignore. Byrne's intercultural communicative competence model stresses the importance of gaining the ability to savoir s'engager in order to evaluate critically and on the basis of explicit criteria, perspectives, practices, and products in one's own and other cultures and countries. Byrne proposes that all language teaching should promote a position which acknowledges respect for human dignity and equality of human rights as the democratic basis for social interaction. Similarly, Lance and Billings noted that in a culturally relevant classroom, students learn to develop a sociopolitical consciousness that allows them to critique the cultural norms, values, mores, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequities. Unfortunately, our current French as a second language curriculum does not adequately and specifically address critical consciousness in the intercultural understanding expectations. The curriculum asks FSL educators to teach students to learn aspects of culture in diverse French speaking communities around the world, without asking educators to stimulate the development of a mindset to make sense of the social and political contradictions and tensions that exist. That is critical cultural consciousness. To go in depth about essentializing culture and developing a mindset of critical consciousness, please consult the Viewer's Guide, which has a reflection activity to critically examine the popular FSL activity, French Cultural Fair. When we do our varied activities that focus on the diversity of the francophonie, it is important to contextualize all perceptions and perspectives of those countries historical, social, political, and economic. A French as a second language educator who teaches from a culturally relevant stance must engage in teaching approaches that develop student critical consciousness by challenging students to question why things are the way they are. FSL educators must embrace anti oppressive teaching strategies which aim to dismantle social injustice perpetuated by systemic inequities based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and identity, age, class, ability, religion, and other social identities. As French as a second language educators, we need to go beyond bonhomme, baguette, et beret. We need to move away from engaging in stereotypical, typecast, pigeonhole, and erroneous experiences that are essentialists. That is, the belief that there's a fixed set of criteria attributed to a certain aspect of culture. For example, discussions on culture should be framed with important concepts of equity literacy, like the French colonial history and stories of resistance, resilience, cultural imperialism, French as a tool of oppression and preservation in Canada, dominance, survival, privilege, bias, social identity, and intersectionality, knowing that these concepts support learners in developing an intercultural, cultural, critical consciousness. Our French as a second language students need to approach culture, theirs and others, with this critical lens so as to make sense of it and develop authentic and meaningful intercultural awareness and skills. Throughout the French as a Second Language curriculum in Ontario, expectations that deal with the development of intercultural understanding are included in each of the four interconnected strands: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. These expectations help students make connections and relate to diverse French speaking communities and other societies. Students will develop skills in accessing and understanding information about various French speaking communities and cultures, and will apply that knowledge for the purposes of interaction. Intercultural awareness and understanding are key aspects of global citizenship, which encompasses citizenship at all levels, from local school and community to Canada and the world beyond. How do we develop a mindset for exploring identity and culture, self and others, while learning French as a second language? Through our exploration of identity, the intercultural dimension, and culturally relevant pedagogy, we see that refining our critical consciousness creates habits of mind that question, push back to institutional and personal systems. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Language Teachers Association, or OMLTA. The OMLTA is a nonprofit professional organization that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. Today, it continues to be a leader in professional learning and advocacy, inspiring and connecting Ontario's French and international languages educators.